The bombers are turning toward Berlin, and this time the German defenders see something they were never supposed to see. Not just the heavy bombers, not just the high white trails over the Reich, but fighters, American fighters, single-engine fighters, still there, still climbing, still holding formation as the German capital comes within reach. For years, the Luftwaffe had counted on distance. Distance was supposed to be Germany's shield. Distance was supposed to thin out the escorts. Distance was supposed to leave the American bombers alone over the deepest part of the Reich. But in March of 1944, that shield cracked. The P-51 Mustang had arrived over Berlin, and for German forces it was a cold, unmistakable message. The Americans had not just built a better escort. They had changed the war in the air. A fighter that could leave Britain, cross into Germany, reach the capital, stay with the heavy bombers, and come back again. A fighter with the range to get there, the engine to fight there, and the mission to make sure the Luftwaffe could not hide there. Hermann Göring would later be said to have admitted, in effect, that when Mustangs appeared over Berlin, he knew the game was over. The exact words are disputed, but the meaning was not, because every German pilot looking up at those long-range escorts understood the same brutal fact. The sky over Germany was no longer theirs. It belonged to the men of the 8th Air Force, and to the Mustang. Only weeks earlier, during Operation Argument, the campaign remembered as Big Week, American commanders had made a decision that turned escort fighters from guards into hunters. General Jimmy Doolittle changed the job. The fighters would not merely cling to the bombers, they would pursue and destroy the Luftwaffe. The bombers would draw German fighters up, and then the American escorts would go after them. That was the trap, that was the escalation, and the P-51 made it possible. Because before the Mustang, the problem was simple. American bombers could go deep, but American fighters could not always go with them. That gap was where the Luftwaffe lived. That gap was where German commanders placed their hopes. A bomber formation deep over Europe, without fighter cover, was vulnerable. But if a fighter could fly as far as the bombers, and still fight at altitude, then the whole equation changed. The Luftwaffe was no longer intercepting an isolated bomber stream. It was being pulled into a fight against an American system: bombers, escorts, production, training, replacement pilots, fuel, drop tanks, engines, a whole national machine reaching across the sky. And at the front of that machine was a sleek single-engine fighter with a British-designed heart built in America. The Mustang's Packard V1650 was a Merlin 66, manufactured under license in the United States. That engine mattered. It was not just power, it was power at height. With a two-stage supercharger, the Merlin-powered Mustang delivered excellent high-altitude performance. That was exactly where the bomber war lived, up in the thin air, up where the German Bf-109 and Fw-190 had to meet the American assault. And according to the record, the Merlin Mustang could outperform those German fighters at altitude. That was the nightmare for the Luftwaffe. Not an escort that barely reached the edge of the fight, not a machine that arrived tired, short on fuel, and desperate to turn home, but a fighter that could go deep, stay dangerous, and still have the legs to return. With drop tanks, the Merlin-powered P-51 could reach more than 1,600 miles, more than 2,500 kilometers, and the later P-51D, with two large tanks, could pass 2,000 miles. For a single-engine fighter based in Britain, that was revolutionary. It meant the Luftwaffe could no longer look at a map and say, here is where the escorts must leave, here is where the bombers become ours, here is where distance protects the Reich. The Mustang erased that comfort, and it did it with American practicality. External fuel tanks to get to the fight, a high-altitude engine to survive the fight, 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns to win the fight, then home. That is the kind of engineering that changes history, not flashy, not magical, just the right machine, at the right moment, with the right mission. And in February 1944, that mission changed everything. Big Week ran from February 20th to February 25th. Its official name was Operation Argument. Its purpose was not just to bomb, it was to force a decision in the air. The Luftwaffe would have to rise and defend. And when it rose, the 8th Air Force fighters would be waiting. The new order from Doolittle turned the escorts loose. Pursue and destroy. Those words matter. They meant the fighters were not tied so tightly to the bomber boxes that they surrendered the initiative. They could range ahead. They could break out. They could meet the German fighters before they reached the bombers. They could chase. They could press. They could make the Luftwaffe pay for every interception. The bombers became the draw. The Luftwaffe saw the heavy formations and had to respond, but the response now carried a price. American fighters were no longer just a shield, they were a sword. And the P-51 was arriving in weight at the very moment that sword was needed most. The Mustang had the range to go to the target and back. It had the performance to take on any German piston-engine fighter. That combination was devastating, because air superiority is not won by one dramatic pass. It is won by attrition, by making the enemy come up again, and again, and again, until the enemy cannot replace what he has lost. Big Week did that. The Luftwaffe lost roughly 262 fighters and around 100 veteran pilots. That second number was the deeper wound. Airplanes can be built, but experienced pilots are not stamped out of a factory line overnight. A veteran fighter pilot carries judgment, timing, altitude sense, formation discipline, combat instinct. Those take time. Germany did not have enough time. The United States had production. The United States had training at scale. The United States had a system that could feed the air war with machines and trained men. The Luftwaffe was being forced into a battle of replacement, and America was built to win that kind of battle. That is the part German forces had to face. Not merely that the Mustang was fast, not merely that it could fly far, but that it was part of something larger, a national capacity, an Allied air campaign, a flow of aircraft and pilots that could keep coming. The Luftwaffe could still fight, but after Big Week, it was fighting inside a tightening ring. Every time it rose to defend the Reich, it risked losing the one thing it could least afford: its experienced pilots. The German command had counted on a defensive advantage. They were fighting near home. They knew the skies. They knew the targets. They could concentrate fighters against bomber streams. But Doolittle's new tactics made that advantage dangerous. The bombers brought the Luftwaffe up. The escorts hunted it, and the Mustang gave those escorts reach. That was the first escalation. America solved the range problem. The second escalation was tactical. America changed the rules of escort. The third escalation was psychological. Berlin. Because Berlin was more than a target on a map. Berlin was the capital, the center, the place that distance and defense were supposed to guard. On March 4, 1944, P-51s made the first escort mission to the Berlin area. 2 days later, on March 6, came the first major incursion to Berlin, and that day carried a historic mark. It was the first time single-engine fighters made the roughly 100-mile round trip to the German capital. Think about what that meant, from Britain, across hostile airspace, to Berlin and back. A single-engine fighter doing the work once thought beyond reach. The Luftwaffe now had to look upward over its own capital and see American escort fighters with the bombers. Not twin-engine long-range machines, not some limited appearance at the edge of Germany. Single-engine Mustangs. The kind of fighter German pilots expected to meet closer to the coast. Now overhead, over Berlin. That was the astonishment. Not because German officers lacked technical knowledge. They understood aircraft. They understood range. They understood altitude. That is exactly why the sight mattered. They knew what it meant. It meant the American bomber offensive could be protected all the way in. It meant the Luftwaffe could be engaged over the heart of Germany. It meant the old safe zones were gone. The P-51 became the first single-engine fighter based in Britain to penetrate Germany. the first to reach Berlin, and the first to accompany the heavy bombers there. That was not just a record, it was a warning. The air war had moved into a new phase. The Luftwaffe could still scramble, it could still oppose, but now every defense carried an American escort all the way to the center, and those escorts were not simply waiting to be attacked. They had permission to hunt. This is where pride comes from, not from arrogance, from achievement, from the sight of American industry and Allied strategy solving a problem that had stood in the way of victory. The problem was distance. America answered with range. The problem was altitude. America answered with the Merlin-powered Mustang. The problem was German interception. America answered with Doolittle's order, pursue and destroy. The problem was attrition. America answered with production and training at scale. That is how air superiority is won, not by wishing, not by speeches, by engineering, by doctrine, by logistics, by pilots willing to fly deep into enemy airspace in a single-engine fighter and stay with the heavy bombers all the way. The Mustang's drop tanks were simple in concept. Carry extra fuel, use it on the way. Discard the tanks when the fight demanded performance. But that simple idea had enormous consequences. A fighter no longer had to choose between escort range and combat ability in the same old way. It could stretch out across Europe, then fight. And when combined with the Packard-built Merlin and its two-stage supercharger, the result was a machine built for the altitude where American heavy bombers needed help. That is why the P-51 mattered so much to the 8th Air Force. The bombers did not need escorts that could almost keep up. They needed fighters that could be there when it counted, over the target, on the way in, on the way out, at altitude. And in March 1944, the Luftwaffe discovered that the Americans now had exactly that. The old German calculation had rested on separation. Separate the bombers from their escorts. Attack when the escorts turn back. Make the deep raids costly. Delay the build-up of Allied air power. But after Big Week and the arrival over Berlin, that calculation was broken. The Mustang could go where the bombers went, and Doolittle's fighters could go where the German fighters were. That second point is critical. A close escort can be defensive, it can protect, it can react. But a fighter force ordered to pursue and destroy can seize the tempo. It can make the defender uncomfortable. It can force the interceptors to think not just about reaching the bombers, but about surviving the escorts. That changes the mental load in the cockpit. It changes the timing of an attack. It changes the risk of every climb, every approach, every withdrawal. The Luftwaffe had been trying to stop the bomber offensive. Now it had to defend itself from the escorts drawn into the same battle, and the Americans had chosen the battlefield. They used the bomber offensive to compel the Luftwaffe to appear. Then they used long-range fighters to attack it. That is an unforgiving strategy, and Big Week showed the result. Roughly 262 German fighters lost, around 100 veteran pilots gone. By about April 1st, 1944, air superiority had passed irrevocably to the Allies. That word matters, irrevocably, not temporarily, not for one raid, not for one sector. The balance had shifted. The German fighter force had been worn down in a way it could not repair fast enough. That was the real turning point. Machines were important, but trained men were decisive. The United States could produce aircraft at scale. It could train pilots at scale. It could put a fighter like the Mustang into combat in numbers. Germany could not replace veteran losses at the same pace. So every successful American mission did more than get bombers to a target. It cut into the future of the Luftwaffe. Every experienced German pilot lost in that period meant fewer instructors, fewer leaders, fewer skilled defenders for the next battle. Attrition became a one-way door, and the Mustang helped push it open. There is a reason the Berlin missions carried such weight. They proved the theory in the most visible possible place. The P-51 was not merely a promising escort. It was not merely a good fighter. It could reach the German capital, with the bombers, from Britain, and return. That fact alone forced German forces to confront the scale of American capability. A single-engine fighter had crossed the distance that once protected the Reich. A machine built around range, altitude performance and firepower had arrived above the capital, and it was there because the United States could match design with production, and production with trained crews. That combination is what overwhelmed the Luftwaffe. Not one element, all of them together. A fighter with long legs, an engine that breathed at height, drop tanks that extended reach, 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns for combat, a doctrine that sent fighters after enemy fighters, a bomber force that compelled the enemy to rise, and a replacement system the Luftwaffe could not match. That is the American advantage in its clearest form. It is not just courage, though courage was required. It is courage multiplied by organization. It is engineering multiplied by logistics. It is tactics multiplied by industrial power. For German forces, the appearance of Mustangs over Berlin was not just a surprise, it was proof. Proof that the American air offensive had crossed a threshold. Proof that the Luftwaffe could no longer rely on geography. Proof that deep Germany was no longer beyond escort range. Proof that the capital itself could be reached by single-engine fighters. That is why Göring's attributed remark has lasted, even with disputed wording, because it captures a reality that the facts support. When Mustangs appeared over Berlin, the air war had changed beyond recovery for Germany. The exact sentence may be uncertain. The strategic meaning is clear. The Luftwaffe had lost the shield of distance, and once that shield was gone, the whole defense weakened. The March missions did not appear from nowhere. They came after Big Week had already forced the Luftwaffe into a punishing contest. From February 20th to 25, the American approach became more aggressive. Doolittle's 8th Air Force was no longer content to escort in the narrowest sense. The goal was to break the German fighter force. The P-51 gave that goal reach. The bomber formations gave it bait, and the German defense, compelled to protect the Reich, had to engage. That is the trap of air defense. If you do not rise, the bombers go through. If you rise, the escorts are waiting. Big Week made that dilemma sharper, and March made it undeniable. Berlin was no longer beyond the escort line. The defenders could look up and see the future. Contrails, bombers, Mustangs, and behind every Mustang, a long chain of American decisions. Build the engine, build the airframe, build the tanks, train the pilots, change the mission, press the fight, return tomorrow. That last part is important. Return tomorrow. Air superiority is cumulative. One mission weakens the enemy. The next mission tests what remains, then the next. And if your side can replace losses, train new pilots, and keep machines coming, while the enemy cannot replace veterans fast enough, the result compounds. That is what happened to the Luftwaffe. Its losses during Big Week were not merely numbers on a report, they were a drain on experience. The kind that cannot be recovered quickly. A new fighter can roll out of a factory, a new veteran cannot. The 8th Air Force understood this, and the Mustang made the understanding operational. It let American fighters fight where the Luftwaffe had to be, not just near the Channel, not just at the edge of occupied Europe, deep over Germany, all the way to Berlin. The P-51's rise was a lesson in timing. Earlier versions of the Mustang had shown promise, but the Merlin-powered version transformed its high-altitude performance. The Packard V1650, a Merlin 66 built under license in the United States, gave it the breathing power it needed. The two-stage supercharger allowed excellent performance up high. That mattered because the escort problem was not a low-level race. It was a high-altitude endurance fight. The bombers flew high, the interceptors came high, the escort had to meet them there. A fighter that was excellent lower down but weaker at altitude would not solve the central problem. The Merlin Mustang did, and with drop tanks, it solved the distance problem too. This is the beauty of the design. It answered both questions at once. Can you get there? Yes. Can you fight there? Yes. For the Luftwaffe, that was the nightmare combination. A short-range escort can be waited out, A poor high-altitude fighter can be outmatched, but a long-range, high-altitude fighter changes the defender's entire plan. The P-51 did not just follow the bomber war, it unlocked it. And when paired with Doolittle's order, it became more than protection, it became pressure. American pilots were no longer simply assigned to orbit near the bomber stream and hope to intercept attackers. They were directed to pursue and destroy. That meant the Luftwaffe faced offensive fighter action over its own airspace. The psychological reversal is enormous. Germany was defending its own sky, yet the American escorts were taking the initiative. That is superiority, not just being present, dictating the terms. For US viewers, this moment deserves to be remembered because it shows the American way of war at its best. Identify the bottleneck, fix the machine, change the tactic, scale the solution, then apply pressure until the enemy system breaks. The bottleneck was escort range. The machine was the P-51 Mustang. The tactic was aggressive fighter employment. The scale was American production and pilot training. The pressure was Big Week, followed by the deep escort missions to Berlin, and the enemy system that broke was the Luftwaffe's ability to contest the air over Germany. By around April 1, 1944, the shift was irreversible. The Allies held air superiority. That did not mean the danger vanished. It did not mean every mission was easy, but it meant the decisive balance had changed. The Luftwaffe could no longer stop the Allied air offensive in the way it had hoped. Its veteran pilot base had been hit hard, its fighter force had been drawn into attrition, and the American escort line now reached the capital. That is the turning point. That is why March 1944 matters. When the first P-51 escorts reached the Berlin area on March 4th, it was a proof of concept written across the sky. When the first major incursion to Berlin followed on March 6th, it became a public demonstration of reach. The distance was roughly 1,100 miles round trip. For single-engine fighters, that was historic. The Luftwaffe had to face it. The Americans could come all the way. They could bring their bombers. They could bring their fighters. And those fighters were not there for show. They had the range to arrive, the performance to fight, and the orders to hunt. Imagine the German assumption before this moment. The deeper the bombers fly, the less protected they become. Now replace that assumption with a new reality. The deeper the bombers fly, the deeper the Mustangs come with them. That is not just a tactical change, it is a strategic shock. Because if escorts can reach Berlin, what part of Germany remains beyond the American fighter umbrella? Distance no longer guarantees relief. The defender must fight under worsening terms, and every fight consumes pilots that Germany cannot afford to lose. That is why the Mustang over Berlin became a symbol. It represented the collapse of a defensive promise. The sky over the capital was no longer secure from American fighter escort, and once the capital itself could be reached, the message spread through the entire air war. The 8th Air Force had solved the deep escort problem. The Luftwaffe had to fight anyway, and the cost of fighting kept rising. Big Week was the hammer blow. Berlin was the visible proof. Together, they marked the moment when German air power over the Reich began to lose the decisive contest. The Americans did not need the enemy to be impressed, but the enemy was forced to understand. A nation that could build the Mustang, fit it with a Packard-built Merlin, send it with drop tanks across Europe, arm it with 6.50 caliber Brownings, train pilots at scale, and give them an aggressive mission, was a nation bringing the full weight of modern air power to the fight. That is what the Luftwaffe saw, not just airplanes, a system, and the system was stronger than theirs. This is where the story becomes larger than one aircraft. The P-51 was the sharp edge, but behind it stood the bomber force. Behind the bomber force stood factories. Behind the factories stood training fields. Behind the training fields stood a country able to produce, organize, and sustain a global war effort. The Mustang gave that effort reach. Doolittle's tactics gave it bite, and Big Week gave it the decisive opportunity. The Luftwaffe rose to defend. The American escorts went after it. The losses came, and the losses mattered most in the cockpit. About 100 veteran pilots lost. That is not a statistic to pass over quickly. It is the core of the turning point. A veteran pilot is a combat multiplier. Lose enough of them, and the whole force weakens. New pilots enter with less experience. Units lose confidence. Leaders disappear. The air defense becomes thinner in skill, even if aircraft remain. America's advantage was that it could keep feeding the fight. Production, training, numbers. The Luftwaffe was being ground down in the one resource that could not be replaced quickly: experience. That is why, by early April, Allied air superiority was no longer a temporary gain. It was locked in. The road to that result ran straight through Big Week and then to Berlin. February broke the fighter force. March proved the range, and the Mustang connected the two. A German defender could no longer count on the escorts turning away. A German commander could no longer point to the capital as beyond reach. And Goering, whether or not the famous wording is exact, became associated with the same admission history remembers. Mustangs over Berlin meant the war in the air had turned against Germany. The phrase endures because it is simple, but the reality behind it was complex. Engine design, supercharging, fuel range, drop tanks, machine guns, command decisions, bomber tactics, pilot training, industrial scale, all converging in one image: a P-51 Mustang over Berlin. That image carried the pride of a nation that could solve hard problems under pressure. The enemy expected distance to protect him. American engineering erased the distance. The enemy expected bombers to come alone. American tactics brought hunters. The enemy expected to replace machines. American pressure consumed irreplaceable veterans. And when German forces looked up over their own capital, they saw the answer. The Mustang had made the long trip. The 8th Air Force had brought the fight to the center. The Luftwaffe had been forced into a contest it could not sustain. That was the payoff. Not just Berlin reached, not just bombers escorted, but air superiority seized, by range, by altitude, by courage, by scale. And by American pilots in P-51 Mustangs, flying so far into the heart of Germany that even the enemy understood what it meant. The sky had changed hands.